The summer wind dragged dust through Black Hollow, a town that had long forgotten how to breathe without fear. Black Hollow sat at the tail end of the cattle trail, where tired cowboys came to spend money and sometimes never leave. Fear lived here like an old tenant. It wore the faces of two brothers. Clay Harper, the elder, was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a square jaw, pale eyes, and a beard trimmed short like a soldier who had once followed rules before deciding he preferred breaking them. His temper was quick, his cruelty quicker, shaped by years of getting what he wanted without consequence. His brother, Evan Harper, younger by 5 years, was lean and sharp-featured, with dark hair always combed back and eyes that rarely blinked, the kind of man who spoke softly but noticed everything, his mind sharpened not by anger but by patience. Together, they had bent the town for 3 years, until even the law learned to look away. That law wore a badge on the chest of Miles Turner, a man of 50 with graying hair and tired shoulders, his once straight posture now slightly bent, as if the weight of compromise had settled into his bones. He had been brave once, before marriage, before children, before fear learned his name. Now he enforced only the kind of peace that didn't cost blood he couldn't afford to lose. On a quiet Tuesday morning, a stranger rode in. Elias Boone, 40 years old, carried the look of a man carved by weather and memory alike. Sunburned skin, a rough stubble that never fully became a beard, and eyes the color of storm clouds that had already passed but left damage behind. He moved with a calm economy, every step measured, as if he had learned long ago that wasted motion could get a man killed. His horse, Dusty, an aging roan with dulled coat and steady gaze, followed him not by reins but by trust, the quiet kind built over miles of silence and survival. Elias tied Dusty where the animal could see the street in all directions, then stepped into Hannigan's diner, a narrow place that smelled of coffee and caution. Without asking, without looking, he took a seat at the back table, Clay Harper's table. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Hannigan, a thin, balding man with nervous hands and a habit of wiping already clean counters, froze where he stood. When Clay and Evan entered minutes later, the air tightened. Clay stopped first, eyes locking onto the stranger. Evan paused beside him, studying. Elias did not look up. He turned a page of his newspaper and said quietly, "Coffee." Clay's anger rose like heat off dry ground, but Evan's gaze lingered longer. He saw it then, that stillness. Not ignorance, not arrogance. Something colder. Something certain. The kind of silence that didn't ask permission to exist. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, unexpectedly, Clay turned away. They took another table. Elias drank his coffee slowly, paid, left. And Black Hollow, for the first time in years, felt something shift. Small, fragile, but real. Like the first crack in a wall everyone had believed would stand forever. The sun climbed higher over Black Hollow, but the light did nothing to warm a town that had grown used to shadows. Elias Boone stepped out of Hannigan's diner without looking back, though he could feel the weight of eyes following him, the kind that hoped and feared in equal measure. Hope was dangerous here, and fear had long been the safer habit. Dusty shifted slightly where he stood tied, ears flicking, reading something in the air that men often missed, and Elias rested a hand briefly against the horse's neck, a quiet reassurance passed between two survivors who had learned to trust silence more than words. He did not wander. He chose his direction with purpose and walked toward the far end of the street where a narrow wooden shop leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing. This was where Bennett Cole worked. Bennett Cole was a thin man in his late 50s, with hollow cheeks and fingers permanently stained by varnish and ash, his gray hair falling unevenly around a face that had grown used to grief long before it grew old. Once he had been a carpenter who built cradles and tables, but 3 years of Harper rule had reshaped his trade into something darker, and now he measured lives not in years, but in inches of pine. He looked up as Elias entered, eyes narrowing in the cautious way of a man who had learned that strangers often meant work he did not want. Elias's voice was calm, almost gentle when he spoke. 2 coffins, ready by sundown. Bennett did not ask why. Men who spoke like that rarely gave answers that made a difference. He only nodded slowly, though his hands trembled just enough to betray that he understood exactly what the request meant. By midday, the words had spread through Black Hollow like a dry whisper carried on wind. In the Red Lantern Saloon, Clay Harper slammed his glass down hard enough to crack it, his pale eyes burning with insult more than curiosity, while Evan Harper leaned back in his chair, fingers loosely folded, expression unreadable. Where Clay saw a challenge, Evan saw intention, and that unsettled him more. "He's inviting it," Clay muttered. Evan shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "He's counting on it." Elias, meanwhile, walked into the marshal's office without knocking. Miles Turner looked up, surprise flickering across his tired face before settling into something more cautious. The room smelled faintly of dust and old paper, a place where decisions had been postponed too many times. Elias did not waste words. He asked about the killings, the land taken, the people who had disappeared quietly enough that no one dared to count them aloud. Miles answered, voice low, each word carrying the weight of compromise. When Elias asked about his children, the question landed heavier than any accusation. Miles looked down at his hands, rough and worn, and for a moment the badge on his chest seemed smaller. 7 and 9, he said, and something inside him shifted. Not courage, not yet, but the memory of it. That memory led Elias to the Dawson freight yard. The building stood sturdy despite the neglect creeping around it, like a stubborn refusal to bow. Grace Dawson met him at the door. She was tall, with sun-browned skin and dark auburn hair pulled back tightly, her posture straight despite the strain in her shoulders, eyes sharp and steady, the kind that had learned to hold fear in place without letting it spill. 2 weeks of pressure had carved something stronger into her, not hardness, but resolve. Inside, her father, Walter Dawson, lay on a narrow bed, a broad man now reduced by injury, his once powerful frame weakened, gray beard untrimmed, breath shallow but stubborn. The kind of man who had built something with his hands and refused to let it be taken even when it cost him dearly. Grace spoke without hesitation, telling Elias everything, not because she trusted him, but because there was no one else left to tell. Elias listened, his face unchanged, though something old flickered behind his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, of a story he had heard before in another town with different names and the same ending. When she finished, silence settled between them. Then Elias spoke, his voice low and certain. "This afternoon you stay inside. Lock the doors. Only open them for the law." Grace studied him, searching for doubt, for arrogance, for anything that might break under pressure. She found none. As Elias stepped back into the sunlight, the town felt different again. Not safer, not yet, but a line toward something inevitable. Behind him, Grace watched through the doorway, her grip tightening slightly on the frame, and for the first time in weeks, fear loosened its hold just enough to make room for something quieter, something steadier. The afternoon light stretched long across Black Hollow, as if even the sun hesitated to stay too close. Elias Boone did not wait for trouble. He went looking for its shape. He moved through the town slowly, not as a drifter killing time, but as a man measuring distance, shadow, and consequence. Every step he took had purpose. He studied the angles of rooftops, the width between buildings, the uneven boards of the wooden walkways that could trip a careless foot in the wrong second. His eyes traced second-floor windows where a rifle might appear, narrow alleys that could hide a man or swallow him whole, and doorways that offered cover for those who knew how to use it. At 40, Elias no longer believed in speed alone. Speed was a young man's religion. Survival, he had learned, belonged to those who decided the ending before the first shot was ever fired. He stepped into the hardware store just off the main street, the bell above the door giving a tired ring. Samuel Reed stood behind the counter, a thin man in his early 50s with sloping shoulders and a face lined not by age but by careful restraint. His sandy hair had thinned unevenly, and his hands, though steady, carried the quiet tension of someone who had spent years pretending not to notice what he could never forget. Once Samuel had tried to stand up to men like the Harpers. There was a faint scar along his jaw, the result of a beating that had taught him the cost of defiance. Since then, he had learned to survive by watching. Samuel spoke in a low voice, eyes flicking toward the window as if expecting the street itself to overhear. He explained what the town already knew but rarely said aloud. Clay Harper thrived on spectacle, his violence loud and public, a performance meant to keep fear alive. Evan Harper was something else entirely, quieter, calculating, the kind of man who waited until all outcomes were laid out before choosing the one that left him standing. Clay breaks things, Samuel said, almost to himself. Evan decides what gets broken. He added that 3 men, regulars loyal to the Harpers, positioned themselves around the Red Lantern each afternoon, creating a loose perimeter that turned the saloon into a trap for anyone foolish enough to challenge them. Elias listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, though his mind moved quickly behind his stillness, placing each piece into a larger pattern. When Samuel mentioned the positions of the men, Elias's gaze shifted slightly, as if he could already see the street rearranging itself into lines of movement and fire. "They'll spread out," Samuel added quietly. "They always do." Elias gave a small nod. "Good," he said, and that single word unsettled Samuel more than any threat could have. Outside, Elias moved Dusty from the open hitching post to a narrow alley behind the hardware store. The horse followed without resistance, hooves quiet against the dirt, head low but attentive. Dusty was older now, his coat dulled by years of sun and travel, but his eyes remained clear, steady, the eyes of an animal that had learned to read danger before it arrived. Elias placed a hand against the horse's neck, fingers pressing lightly into familiar muscle. "Stay ready," he murmured. Dusty did not move, but something in the stillness answered. For a moment, Elias stood there, alone in the shade of the alley, and the past brushed close enough to be felt. Not as memory, but as weight. There had been another town once, another street where things had gone wrong because he had been too late, too trusting, or simply too human. He did not think about it long. Men like him survive by knowing when not to look back. As the sun lowered, Black Hollow began to close itself off. Curtains drawn, doors latched, conversations cut short. People moved quickly, heads down, each one aware of what the coming hour might bring. From behind glass and wood, eyes watched the emptying street, waiting for something they could not name but knew would arrive. Elias stepped back onto Front Street as the light turned gold and thin. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The town had already arranged itself. The players had taken their places, whether they knew it or not. Somewhere behind him, in Bennett Cole's shop, 2 coffins waited in silence, their measurements precise, their purpose certain. And as the last of the doors closed, Black Hollow held its breath, the way a man does just before the trigger is pulled. The sun bled gold across Front Street, stretching shadows into long, silent warnings. Elias Boone stood alone in the open, not tense, not loose, simply ready, the way a man becomes when he has already lived through the outcome in his mind and accepted whatever follows. His coat shifted lightly in the wind, dust clinging to the fabric like memory that refused to leave. Behind closed curtains, Black Hollow watched him, the town holding its breath as if sound itself might tip the balance. Somewhere deeper in the stillness, Dusty waited in the alley, unmoving, reading the moment with the quiet instinct that had kept both horse and rider alive longer than most men lasted. The doors of the Red Lantern swung open, and the Harper brothers stepped into the light. Clay Harper moved first, shoulders squared, chin lifted, his broad frame casting a heavy shadow. Anger sharpened his features, the kind of anger that had carried him through years of unchecked power, but now clouded his judgment. Beside him, half a step behind, Evan Harper walked with measured calm, his lean face unreadable, gray eyes sweeping the street, searching not for a fight, but for advantage. He saw the empty windows, the closed doors, the unnatural silence. He understood what Clay did not. This was not a street waiting to be taken. It was a stage already set. Around them, their 3 men took positions. One stood near the saloon porch, a stocky man with a crooked nose and a habit of cracking his knuckles when nervous. Another lingered by a water trough, tall and wiry, his coat hanging loose enough to hide the movement of his hand. The third hovered near the edge of an alley, younger than the rest, his face tight with the kind of fear men tried to hide behind bravado. None of them realized they had already been placed exactly where Elias needed them. Clay stopped 30 feet from Elias, a smile pulling thin across his face. "Heard you ordered 2 coffins," he said, voice loud enough to carry. "You always this confident, or just stupid?" Elias did not move. His eyes rested on Clay, then shifted once, briefly to Evan, as if acknowledging the only real threat present. "I don't miscount," he replied. The first shot came from the porch. It was fast, practiced, but it was already too late. Elias had stepped aside before the trigger was fully pulled, the bullet cutting empty air. His own revolver appeared as if it had always been in his hand, and the man on the porch dropped before the echo reached the far end of the street. 1. The second man reacted on instinct, faster than fear could stop him, firing from near the trough. The shot grazed past Elias, close enough to stir the edge of his coat. Elias turned, not rushed, not hesitant, and answered. 2. The third man hesitated. That was his mistake. Fear made him shift, breaking position, exposing himself in the exact line Elias had predicted hours before. The shot was clean. 3. The street fell silent again, but it was a different silence now, one filled with realization. Clay roared, the sound raw and furious, and reached for his gun. He was strong, dangerous, but in that moment, he was also predictable. Elias fired once. The bullet struck the revolver in Clay's hand, sending it spinning into the dust. Clay staggered, dropping to one knee, his face twisted not just in pain, but in disbelief, as if the world had suddenly refused to follow the rules he had written for it. Evan did not move. He looked at the bodies, then at his brother, then back at Elias. His mind worked quickly, calculating what remained. For the first time in years, every path ended the same way. His shoulders lowered slightly, the smallest surrender, but unmistakable. Slowly he raised his hands. From behind the windows, the town began to breathe again. Doors opened, faces appeared, people stepped out carefully at first, then with growing certainty, as if they needed to see it with their own eyes to believe it was over. The weight that had pressed down on Black Hollow for 3 long years began to lift, not all at once, but enough to be felt. Sheriff Miles Turner walked forward from his office, each step steadier than the last. His back straightened as he approached, the badge on his chest catching the last light of the day. He looked at Clay, then at Evan, and something old returned to his expression. Not the man he had been before, but a version of him that could stand again. Without ceremony, he cuffed Clay first, then Evan, the sound of metal closing echoing softly in the quiet street. At the far end, Bennett Cole stood in the doorway of his shop, watching with hollow eyes that had seen too much death to mistake its meaning. Behind him, 2 coffins rested side by side, their lids smooth, their purpose fulfilled in ways no one in the town had fully understood that morning. Elias lowered his gun. The wind moved again, carrying dust across the street, soft and indifferent. The fight had lasted seconds. The change it brought would last far longer. Night settled over Black Hollow with a stillness that felt different, as if the darkness itself had lost its authority. The street where blood had touched dust only hours before now held lantern light instead of fear, and for the first time in years, doors stayed open after sundown, not wide, not careless, but enough to suggest that something had shifted beyond repair. Elias Boone stood near the edge of the street, not in the center where men would thank him, but in the shadows where he had always belonged, watching as Sheriff Miles Turner moved with a steadiness that had returned to him piece by piece since the afternoon. Clay Harper sat bound, his anger hollowed out, reduced to something smaller than the man who had once commanded a town. Beside him, Evan Harper remained silent, his composure intact but changed, the calculation gone from his eyes now that there were no outcomes left to control. The stagecoach arrived just after nightfall, its wheels grinding softly against the dirt. From it stepped Judge Henry Calloway, a tall man in his early 60s with a narrow frame and a long, lined face that carried the weight of decisions made over decades. His white hair was combed neatly back, his suit plain but clean, and his eyes sharp behind thin spectacles. The eyes of a man who had seen law fail often enough to recognize when it had one last chance to stand. Years earlier, Calloway had stopped coming to Black Hollow, not out of fear, but because the system he represented had been quietly pushed aside by men like the Harpers. Tonight he had returned because something had changed, and he intended to see it through. Inside the small courthouse, the air felt tight but honest. Witnesses came forward one by one. Grace Dawson stood first, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her face, recounting the threats, the pressure, the night her father had been beaten for refusing to surrender what was his. Samuel Reed followed, his hands trembling at first before settling as he spoke, years of silence breaking into words that could no longer be held back. Even Hannigan, wiping his hands on a cloth he did not need, told what he had seen, his voice low but clear. Each testimony laid another stone, and slowly the truth that had been buried under fear began to take shape in the open. Elias did not enter the courtroom. He leaned against the outer wall, listening without appearing to, his gaze resting somewhere beyond the buildings, as if already measuring the road ahead. He understood what many men never did, that the gun ended a moment, but the law decided whether that moment meant anything. By midnight, the decisions were made. Clay Harper was sentenced to hang, his crimes finally given names that could not be denied. Evan Harper, who had built the structure behind his brother's violence, was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars, where calculation would serve him no purpose. The weight that had defined Black Hollow for 3 years was not gone, but it had been broken, and that was enough for a beginning. In the days that followed, Bennett Cole finished his work. 2 coffins stood ready, their wood smooth, their lines precise. One would carry the body of a man who had ruled through fear until fear turned on him. The other, though it held no corpse, marked the burial of something less visible, but far more important: the belief that nothing could ever change. Bennett understood this in his quiet way, sanding the edges with care, as if he were shaping not just wood, but closure. Walter Dawson began to recover slowly, strength returning to a body that had refused to give up even when broken. Grace took over the freight yard fully, her movements purposeful, her posture no longer braced for impact but grounded in something steadier. Sheriff Miles Turner wore his badge differently now, not heavier but clearer, as if he finally remembered what it had been meant to represent before fear had rewritten its meaning. At dawn, before the town had fully awakened, Elias saddled Dusty. The horse stood calm, breath steady in the cool morning air, ready as always without needing to be told. Elias paused only once, glancing back toward the street that had changed without him ever asking it to remember his name. There were no goodbyes waiting for him. Men like Elias did not stay long enough for those. Grace Dawson stood in the doorway of the freight office, watching him go, her hands resting lightly against the wood frame, her expression quiet but certain. She did not call out. Some departures were meant to remain unbroken. Elias turned forward again. The road stretched ahead, pale under the rising light, leading toward places that did not yet know they needed him. Dusty moved at a steady pace, carrying him away from Black Hollow, from the dust, from the memory of a town that had learned at last how to stand without bowing. And behind him, the town breathed, not fully, not freely, but enough to begin again. Out on a quiet road where the dust has already settled, there is a simple truth that lingers long after the gunfire fades. Sometimes the world doesn't change because someone is stronger, but because someone refuses to accept that fear is the way things must be. Not loudly, not perfectly, just quietly, and at the right moment. In everyday life, most battles don't happen on empty streets at sundown. They happen in small decisions. When someone chooses honesty over silence, courage over comfort, kindness over indifference. And just like Black Hollow, change doesn't come all at once. It begins with one person who decides that this isn't right and does something about it. Maybe we are not meant to be heroes. Maybe we are just meant to be present, at the right place for the right reason, for someone who needs it. And sometimes that is more than enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need a little reminder that change is still possible. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this journey has reached. And if you believe in stories that carry meaning, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep writing together. May God watch over you, guide your path, and bring peace to your heart, wherever you are tonight.